It's so good to be here with you tonight. My name is Callie. I didn't have a word for it in elementary school, but now I might call it a panic attack. Back then, I thought of it as a feeling of being a prey animal. Like, there's a jaguar stalking you, even though when you turn around, you can't see it. The jaguar was death. The first technique I remember coming up with to try to make that feeling go away was one that I could use at recess. I'd go stand against the brick wall that you had to stand against if you were bad, but not at the usual bad kid spots, because then an adult would ask questions I didn't have answers for. I'd stand straight with my back against the bumpy brick and put my hand on the top of my head like I was gonna record my height with a pencil. And I'd think to myself, I might sometimes want to be a different height, but I'm never scared that I'm only a certain amount tall. And then I'd put my hands out as wide as they could go and grab onto the brick and think to myself, this is as wide as I can reach. And it never really bothers me that this is as wide as I can reach. And then I'd slide down the wall a little, a few inches, and press my back into the bricks as hard as I could and try to remember being a really, really tiny baby. Try to remember being born. Try to remember before being born. And I couldn't do it. And I'd say to myself, see, there were billions of years before I existed. Callie, there were billions of years before any people can remember anything at all. Remember from the Science Museum that if the Earth was a year old, humans were born at 11:48 p.m. on December 31st. And I think that's really cool. I'm not sad or scared about that. I don't feel bad at all that the mountains are older than anyone. So hey, why can't I just chill out about this? I'm not freaked out that I'm only so tall. I'm not freaked out that I'm only so wide. I'm not freaked out that my life has a start. Why is it so utterly terrifying to remember that I will die? Why does my heart pound and my vision close in and my chest tighten so that I have to remember to breathe on purpose when I remember that I will die just like everyone else? I still have these moments of terror sometimes. It'll sneak in past my defenses when, I'm nervous about a job interview or Congress people call for me and my trans friends to be rounded up and institutionalized. My breath still catches, and it still feels like a creature with long teeth is stalking me. These days, I don't try to talk myself out of it. I say to myself, I remember I'll die, and I'm scared about it. And that doesn't stop it, but saying that truth helps me move through it. It helps me move on to the question of what I want to do in the face of that truth. This reflection tonight is in a series about things that are hard to talk about and the uses of talking about them, and I'm going to be talking about death. One of the things that I learned talking to other people about death in preparation for this reflection is that while lots of people have strong feelings about death, not everybody is scared like me, and other people who are scared about it are scared for different reasons than me. So the thing that gets to me personally, that makes me feel that absolute terror, is the fact that there's an end to my story after which I just don't exist, after which I can't do or feel anything. Pencils down is going to get called before I've checked all my answers. But my dad, who lives mostly in his head, is more afraid that his body will keep going after he loses the ability to think clearly. My friend Jamie, who has seen a number of loved ones go through slow and painful deaths, is more afraid of physical pain and helplessness, and non-existence doesn't really bug them. Do you have big feelings about death? What are yours? Whatever your relationship is with death, I hope this reflection has something for you. I'm saying that we don't talk about death much, but a thought I had is that we're outside a church and this is actually the context that we are most likely to talk about death. Memorial services happen in there. A lot of funerals and burials have a religious bit. The people who built this particular church and most of the people who kept it running for 400 years were kind of obsessed with this one time a guy died and it didn't take. But today, I'm not talking about grief or resurrection. I want to look at the ways that we hide from death by turning it into a simple story, and how those stories, even if we don't believe them, shape the systems we live in and our feelings and actions. And I want to offer some ideas about how we might live outside those stories. First, I want to illustrate how sneakily we can hide the realities of death inside stories by telling you a secret I learned as a game designer, which is that you probably didn't know that most of the games you've been playing are about death or come from games that are about death. Some of this might be obvious. Fortnite is about killing each other and doing the gritty. I can't do the gritty up here, I don't have room. Lots of ancient games are about killing the other player before they kill you, like chess or Go. But the origin of sports is in death, too. The original Olympics, 2,800 years ago, back in ancient Greece, just like the modern ones, were created in the hope of transforming murderous impulses toward war into pretend sporty war. That's also the story of lacrosse, invented in this part of the world about 1,000 years ago to discourage young men of neighboring groups from killing one another. Most team sports, most two-player games, tabletop role-playing games, most action-y video games tap into a deep story of fighting for your life. Even if they're not about that on the surface, they're about that under the surface. In these games that are about fighting for your life, there's one moment at the end of the action where your fate is sealed. If you weren't good enough, you died, you lose. If you were good enough, you win, you live. Let's call this story about death the judgment story. Winners are good. When things are working as they should, good, competent, faithful people live. Losers are bad. When things are working as they should, bad, irresponsible, unfaithful people die. I don't believe the judgment story, but it's infected me. Does anybody else get this thing where something doesn't break your way, and later on in the day, you're like super hard on yourself for something totally unrelated? You're looking for ways that you're bad because you've lost. I've been super involved in spiritual communities of one kind or another over the years. These days I'm here just because my friends are here and I really love to play in this band. But for a lot of that time, I was trying to figure out how I might be a bad person in a way that could explain bad things that had happened to me. I didn't believe the judgment story, but it was so much a part of the world around me that when I experienced some little imitation of death, some loss or harm, my instinct was that I must be bad. So earlier I said the whole history of games is about death, but maybe you're thinking, I just played Chutes and Ladders the other day. That wasn't about death. Pachisi, how's that about death? Nobody dies. You just roll dice and move around a board. Ha ha ha. The oldest game that we know about has rolling and moving. It's a 5,000-year-old Egyptian game called Senet. In Senet, you're already dead at the start of the game. And it's about making your way, you roll and move through the very dangerous near afterlife, the space in between worlds. And you try to get to the Hall of Two Truths, where Anubis is going to weigh your heart against a feather, and depending on the results, either your heart is lighter than the feather and you get into the final afterlife, or a crocodile lion hippo eats your heart and its pencils down for you. Everything with a finish space, like the game of life, or a score track like cribbage, ultimately evolved from a family of ancient games where you perfect yourself in death, or you perfect yourself for death. Let's call this story about death the salvation story. Just on the other side of death and apocalypse lies something wonderful. You felt a tiny version of the salvation story. If you've ever finished some giant project you've oriented your life around for a while, and a couple of days later, you're like, wait, why is everything still basically the same? Why haven't I ascended? Okay, I want us to look now at what happens when these stories about death, the judgment story and the salvation story, get really, really big and popular. Like, imagine if they were the key stories in a couple of religions, and those religions were the main religions in a bunch of empires over a couple thousand years, and those empires conquered most of the planet. What would it be like to live in that world? How could we negotiate with the power of those stories? When the judgment story, that some should live and some should die, grows to the size of a society, there's a word for that Cameroonian historian Achille Mbembe came up with. He came up with the word necropolitics. Necropolitics is when the state decides who is worthy of life and who is worthy of death and makes that happen. Not just with war and with capital punishment, but yeah, with those things, but also by creating forms of living and death, of half-aliveness, like prisons and refugee camps, like forcing people through pregnancies that aren't right for them, like forcing people through puberties that aren't right for them. When Achille Mbembe first wrote about this in 2003, he spent a lot of time talking about how states obscure necropolitics, how they export violence elsewhere to hide the fact that some lives matter more than others. And that is still happening, but the machinery of death is not always subtle, not subtle here these days. Not this week, not in a week when ICE publicly executes Silverio Villegas Gonzalez in Chicagoland and justifies it with a decade-old speeding ticket. And no government officials lower the flag to have staff for him. And no one is fired for failing to grieve him. Necropolitics divides the worthy from the damned in many ways, but often by making literal enemies lists. I'm on at least two myself, despite not being that important to social movements these days, for only a little bit more than being trans in public. I'm on a blacklist of authors that have said something about the genocide in Gaza, and some anti-trans forum somewhere has a bunch of personal information about me, and occasionally I get harassment or threats online on the internet where people know a little bit more about me than they should. It's not that big a deal. I'm sure some people here are on more lists and scarier ones, but this sort of thing, this general sort of thing, has been used by the government recently to decide who to target, and I'm not scared about it. But one way that I want to resist necropolitics is by using its death story, the judgment story, against itself. The judgment story often comes with a pretty image that I'm really fond of. Sometimes some versions of this story, there's a giant divine book that your story or your name gets written into. I love that image. First of all, books are hot. Second of all, it's like a really pretty idea that anybody could matter enough to get written about. And the books of judgment where I want my name recorded are the enemies lists of the forces of death. And I want you there with me. If you want to help people who are on the enemies list of the forces of death, it doesn't help to argue who belongs on the list. It doesn't help to give people advice about how to stay off the lists. Fascism requires targets, and if it doesn't have enough, it will manufacture reasons to target people out of nothing. The way to make these lists useless is to flood them with names. Dividing us into the worthy and the damned is revealed as a ridiculous project if enough people say, I am with the damned. Not just, please stop hurting those people over there, but these are my people. The opposite of necropolitics is solidarity. I like to give homework This is your homework. If you're not there already, how are you going to get your name into that divine book? How are you going to get yourself onto the enemy's lists of the forces of death with me? Your homework is to come up with an actual concrete plan for getting onto the enemy's lists of the forces of death. Put it on your to-do list. Set a deadline for step 1 in a week on your calendar. Go ahead and take out your phone. I'll give you a second. Those of you already on as many enemies lists as you can handle, thank you for your service. Your homework. Whose name do you want next to yours? How are you going to invite them in? While you're putting notes in your phone, a strategy tip here. Asking your senator to turn the speed dial down a notch on the death machines? Great. Making a sign with a very clever pun about the death machines and showing up to the march? Genuinely useful. Death machine book club? Cool. Keep doing it. Those things are all really great. Thank you for those things that you're doing. Probably none of that is going to get your name into the books. How are you going to get in the way of the death machinery enough that it cares who you are, what your name is? A society-sized version of the salvation story is that we just need to do whatever it takes to get to the other side of an election or a technological breakthrough or a Supreme Court case, a lockdown, and then it'll all be great and back to normal and perfect. A society-sized version of the salvation story is that everything's going to be great after the revolution. This can sometimes supercharge necropolitics. I'm watching Democrats who can't seem to think beyond the next midterms, a kind of death moment. And they're openly debating how much they should throw migrant and Palestinian trans lives under a bus to try to eke out some advantage there. And it seems like the answer for a lot of them is to line up the buses and get throwing. That's not a new position, really, but the openness about the calculations behind it makes the moral bankruptcy of it more obvious. But even if we're committed to solidarity, the salvation story can keep us from acting or make us feel hopeless. When we're in the salvation story, we might relentlessly keep trying to heal our trauma and perfect ourselves into the person we would have been. We might get too excited about late-stage capitalism and the long arc of history bending, as if things getting better were as inevitable as death and didn't require our effort. When we're in the salvation story, we might restrict our vision to projects we can win in our lifetimes. We might not try things that might not work. We might get trapped in mourning how far away from paradise we are. And everything that's imperfect tells us that we've failed. But the truth is that as long as we have any amount of imagination and love, we will always be short of the world that we wish for. There is no perfection. There is no end to what we can say. Joyously, there is no end to what we can save. Most of the work isn't winning or perfecting. We hold power accountable, and we do it again the next day. We protect and care for each other, and we do it again the next day. We don't ever finish the work of listening to each other. We do simple, useful tasks over and over. You don't build a better world like building the pyramids. Liberation is not a monument that will outlive us. Liberation is more like cooking an awesome meal. You do it again when you want more of it. The good fight is a lot more like housekeeping or like toothbrushing than it is like a fight to the death or the final weighing of your heart. It's kindness itself that is the immortal thing. We visit and we share food and we fix someone's faucet and we listen and we cry together, knowing that the work of care is never completed. We sing and we dance, we hold each other, we kiss, we make each other pretty things, knowing that we can never complete the work of celebrating each other. We meet, we knock on doors, we march, we picket, we strike, We blockade. Yeah, we do the book club. We sabotage. We riot. We print the damn truth. We make enemies of the machinery of death again and again, knowing we will always have more work to do to make the world more just. Every moment of this, every righteous act of ours, every individual casserole and school board meeting and slashed ice SUV tire is brief and will pass away. Many will be forgotten in a few years, most in decades, and all but a very, very, very tiny number in a century or two. But these moments are the place where we get to come into contact with the eternal. Our work done well might not make any particular one of us live any longer. But the work does last forever, and taking part in it is our share of immortality. The work we weave ourselves into continues long, long, long after we're gone. There is no escaping death, but we can escape the judgment story that it's fair or the salvation story that it perfects us, and weave ourselves into a different story where everyone deserves a full measure of life and where there is joyously always more to save. Everything that lives dies, but life itself outlives death. The world tells us that we'll live if we're good and we'll die if we're bad, but you know what? We're gonna die either way. The antidote to necropolitics is solidarity. How are you going to get on the enemy's list of the forces of death? Liberation is like cooking an awesome meal. You do it again when you want more of it. Kindness itself is the immortal thing. The work we weave ourselves into is our share of eternity. There is no finish line. There is joyously always more to save. Everything that lives dies, but life itself outlives death.